The dining room of the Harrington estate had once been a stage for warmth and celebration. Long before wealth became a weapon, it was a place of laughter and clinking glasses, of birthdays and anniversaries wrapped in gold ribbon. But on this night, the chandeliers above the mahogany table cast a cold surgical light. Every crystal shimmered with quiet judgment. Miles Harrington sat at the head of the table, the position he'd inherited from their father, and, some would say, the throne of the family's real estate empire. His knife moved methodically through the steak, as if dissecting not meat, but memory. To his right sat Carolyn, their mother, her pearls trembling each time she reached for her wine glass. And to his left Evan, the brother who had left the business, left the family, and yet, somehow, was back tonight. The reunion had been months in the making, but no one dared call it that. The air was brittle with unspoken calculations. The estate had recently been appraised for $72 million, and rumors of a possible sale had reawakened every buried resentment between the two brothers. Each shared glance was a silent lawsuit waiting to happen. Evan's return was not sentimental, it was strategic. After years of absence, he had suddenly reappeared in a city suit tailored, eyes hollow with whispers that he had bought controlling shares in one of their father's old developments. Miles had pretended not to care, but the tension in his jaw betrayed otherwise. Outside, the ocean gnawed at the cliffs below the estate. The rhythmic crash of waves was the only sound brave enough to fill the silence. A storm was gathering miles offshore, unseen but felt in the flicker of the candlelight. Even the walls seemed to lean closer, hungry for the eruption that everyone knew was inevitable. When the subject of the family reunion surfaced Carolyn hoped might finally mend the fractured bloodline, it landed like a challenge. The idea of everyone under one roof again was laughable to some, unbearable to others. Yet for Evan, it was something more, an opening. The empire had been built on land acres upon acres of oceanfront properties, hillside estates, and downtown towers, but beneath every plot there were ghosts. Deals made in desperation, titles forged in secrecy. A single missing signature that could turn an heir into an outsider. Evan had come home not for reconciliation but for reclamation. He had been the forgotten son, the one their father deemed too sentimental for business, but time had hardened him. His years away had not been wasted, they had been weaponized. Caroline's hand trembled as she reached for the silver bell beside her plate. The sound rang once, sharp and metallic, summoning the house staff to clear the plates. Then no one moved. Every servant knew better than to interrupt when tension dripped so heavily from the air. Then, in that suffocating pause, the words fell from Evan's mouth like a match into dry grass. "Just tell me when the reunion is." The silence that followed was almost holy. The storm outside roared louder, echoing through the glass. Miles's fork froze mid-air, a glint of steel hovering between restraint and rage. The statement wasn't about dinner, it was about war. Because everyone at that table knew what the reunion truly meant, the reading of the revised will. Their father's estate had been divided years ago, but his final trust, the one holding the coastal developments, was still sealed, scheduled to be unveiled only when all surviving family members gathered under one roof again. It was a condition few had questioned until now. The air thickened with dread and ambition. For Mills, the trust represented consolidation, his final claim over everything their father built. For Evan, it was vindication, proof that bloodlines could not be erased with signatures. And for Carolyn, it was a nightmare reborn, the echo of a man who controlled them even from the grave. The dinner ended not with dessert but with distance. Chairs scraped, candles died, and a family portrait above the fireplace watched silently as the three ghosts of its past dispersed into the storm. Outside, the tide rose higher than usual, reaching the edges of the private cliffside path that led to the boathouse. Evan lingered by the window, watching lightning carve white veins across the ocean. He remembered the last time he stood here years ago, when their father had told him he'd never inherit a single acre of Harrington land. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the sea didn't sound like loss. It sounded like return. Miles's reflection flickered in the window beside him, a silent threat. The house had two masters now, and both knew the other wouldn't leave without taking something that wasn't theirs. Far below, a light flickered in the boathouse, though no one had been there for years. The storm crept closer, and in its first heavy drop of rain, the Harrington feud was reborn. The storm broke over the Harrington estate just after midnight. Rain lashed the glass veranda, blurring the horizon where the sea met the sky, until both became one gray mass of motion. The waves rose higher than anyone had seen in years, and each one struck the cliffside like a warning. The house, built on rock and pride, had endured worse. Yet, on this night, something about the storm felt personal, as if the sea itself had been waiting for this reunion to begin. Inside, the power flickered. The chandeliers dimmed, leaving the corridors to breathe in shadow. Caroline had retreated to her suite hours ago, her heart too fragile for the tension her sons brought. Miles remained in his study, nursing a glass of scotch and staring at the family as original property maps, hand-drawn by their father in the 1970s, long before success had turned them into strangers. Evan, meanwhile, wandered the lower halls like a ghost, reacquainting himself with the walls that had exiled him. Every corridor whispered of his childhood, the oil paintings of ancestors, the faint scent of cedar from his father's old library, the worn marble where he once chased their family dog. Each step stirred memories he didn't want but needed. Because within this house lay the key to everything that had been denied to him. On the third floor, hidden behind a locked walnut door, was the vault room, a space no one had entered since their father's death. The original trust documents, deeds and wills had been sealed there, guarded by an attorney who lived halfway across the country. The agreement was simple: when the family was whole again, the vault would open. But whole had never been part of the Harrington language. Evan paused before the locked door. Lightning illuminated his face for a fraction of a second, enough to reveal not curiosity, but calculation. He knew his father's handwriting better than anyone, the little flourishes in each signature, the inconsistencies that came after the first stroke of whiskey in the evening. There had been talk, even before the funeral, that one of the property deeds had been altered, a forgery buried within authenticity. The sea rumbled. The old brass key still hung in the hallway frame, behind a glass pane marked private estate use only. It was symbolic, a relic. No one had ever dared touch it, until now. Evan reached up, broke the glass with a deliberate strike of his hand, and pulled the key free. The sound of shattering carried faintly down the staircase, where Miles was still awake, listening. The lock gave way with a reluctant sigh. Inside, the vault smelled of dust and old money, leather, metal, and the faint sweetness of mildew clinging to paper. Files were stacked in perfect order: title certificates, shareholder ledgers, notarized amendments. Each folder represented a story of power won or stolen. At the far end, under a tarnished brass plaque reading Harrington Holdings Trust, Revision 4, lay a sealed envelope, its wax still intact. The seal bore their father's insignia, an interlocking H over a crescent line of ocean waves. He didn't panic. Instead, he set the envelope back down and scanned the room. There, tucked beside the files, was an older portfolio labeled Preliminary Distribution Notes -2005. The paper edges had yellowed, the ink bled with time. Inside were drafts, versions of the trust before it had been finalized. His father's notes sprawled across margins, annotations, corrections, and phrases circled in red. Evan's portion reconsidered. Remove? Conditional clause to be revised. A small smile tugged at his lips. Remove. But the final trust had been sealed before that revision was ever notarized. Which meant, if this draft was real, the condition was never lawfully enforced. He folded the draft gently, slid it into his coat pocket, and extinguished the single bulb that hung over the vault door just as Miles appeared in the corridor. The brothers met in silence. Only the hum of the storm filled the space between them. Miles's expression didn't waver. He had always been the quieter predator, a man who didn't strike until every witness was looking elsewhere. His eyes drifted to the broken glass on the floor, then to the open vault door behind Evan. For a moment, neither moved. The family home had seen its share of confrontations, boardroom battles disguised as dinners, power plays masked as family meetings, but never one like this. Evan turned without a word and began walking back toward the staircase. His shoes left faint imprints on the marble, a trail of moisture from the rain that had followed him in. He didn't look back. Miles didn't follow, not yet. By morning, the storm had cleared. The estate sat in eerie calm, sunlight spilling through the windows like an apology. Caroline descended late, her face pale, her eyes restless from another sleepless night. The house staff had already begun cleaning the shards of glass near the vault corridor, whispering of strange noises and lights during the storm. Evan was gone, his car missing from the garage, his bedroom untouched since last evening. But what lingered in the study, left neatly upon Miles's desk, was enough to rattle even him. A single sheet torn from the draft trust, annotated in their father's handwriting. In absence of familial unity, distribution shall default to equal heirs. Land is memory, not ownership. The words burned themselves into Miles's mind. Their father, the architect of their empire, had left behind one final riddle, one that threatened to erase decades of hierarchy. Equal heirs. That phrase alone could dismantle everything. Miles slammed the paper into a drawer and locked it. He told no one what he'd seen. But by the time evening fell again, the first legal inquiries had already begun. Calls from the family attorney, questions about revised conditions, and rumors that Evan had been seen downtown meeting with investors tied to Harrington properties. The reunion was no longer a possibility, it was a countdown. Beneath the estate, where the cliffs met the sea, the waves struck the stone harder than before, eroding it grain by grain. The Harrington name had once meant endurance. But the cracks were spreading, invisible now, inevitable later. And as night returned, a courier van approached the gates. The driver stepped out, signed the ledger, and handed a sealed document addressed to Miles Harrington Confidential. Inside was a notice from the probate court. A petition had been filed that morning by Evan Harrington, requesting the immediate unsealing and public audit of the family trust. The reunion had just been forced. The letter from the court lay unopened on Miles Harrington's desk until the morning sun reached it. It was not hesitation that held him back, but calculation. Every decision in his life, every signature, every silence had been a transaction. Even grief had been monetized. The mahogany study, once their father's domain, was heavy with inheritance. Every object spoke of legacy. The globe marked with red pins of properties acquired the model skyscraper that had been the blueprint of Harrington Holdings. Rise the ledger books lined with triumphs written in black ink and mistakes buried in red. But this letter, plain and creased, carried a threat that not even his father could have controlled. When he finally slid the envelope open, the contents were brief, almost surgical in tone. A petition has been filed requesting immediate audit and disclosure of the Harrington Trust under Clause 9b equal distribution in absence of unified family consent. There it was again. The clause Evan had uncovered. The one their father never meant to be found. Miles reread it several times. The words mocked him, each one a needle in the empire's armor. Equal distribution. Unified consent. Evan had chosen the perfect weapon, legality. Not vengeance, not scandal, but paperwork. It was genius in its restraint. Outside the window, the estate grounds glittered under morning dew. The storm had stripped the trees bare in places, exposing their roots, and the cliffs showed raw stone where the sea had bitten away the earth. Everything looked unsettled, as if nature itself had taken sides. In the kitchen, the staff whispered. News of the audit spread fast. Some had overheard Evan's name in the early morning phone calls. Others had seen unfamiliar vehicles idling outside the gate, journalists, perhaps, or rival developers who smelled blood in the water. Miles called the family attorney Samuel Kent, a man who had served their father with unwavering discretion. Kent's voice over the line was calm but heavy with subtext. The petition, he explained, could not be stopped without consensus. All surviving heirs had to appear in court within 2 weeks to verify their claims. If one refused, the clause defaulted automatically, full equal division across every documented heir, legitimate or otherwise. It was that last phrase that turned Miles cold. Documented heir, because their father had not been a simple man. His affairs had always been complex. The whisper of illegitimacy had lingered for decades, rumors of a second family somewhere along the coast, a woman from the early years of the business, before Caroline's marriage secured the social ladder. No one had ever found proof, no one had ever dared look. But if Evan's petition forced a full audit, every skeleton buried under the Harrington name would rise. Miles paced the study, the carpet beneath his shoes worn thin from years of the same motion, pacing while thinking, pacing while planning. His mind moved like a developer drafting blueprints for a disaster recovery. If the trust were split, the properties would fragment. The holdings company would lose majority control. Investors would flee, share prices would collapse. The empire would die, not in flames but in balance sheets. Meanwhile, in a high-rise downtown, Evan stood by the window of a rented office overlooking the city skyline their father had once conquered. The petition was filed, the gears already turning. He knew Miles would react fast, but speed couldn't change law. What mattered now was exposure. The court's auditors would comb through every asset, the oceanfront estates, the inland developments, the unlisted accounts. But Evan's goal wasn't just to divide the fortune. It was to reveal what had been hidden. Because deep in those files was one development, Harbor Point Estates, a project completed 15 years ago, the crown jewel of the Harrington portfolio. Its land deeds had always been suspect. The original owner, a fisherman who refused to sell, had vanished. Officially, the purchase was clean. But whispers persisted that the man's signature was forged, that a bribe buried the investigation. Evan had found the first trace of that story years ago, long after he left home. And now, through the audit, he could finally drag it into the light. Caroline, fragile but still sharp, received her notice the same morning. Her trembling hands held the paper as if it were a confession. The thought of court, of public scrutiny, filled her with dread. For decades she had held her silence, protecting the family's name even as it devoured itself. She knew her late husband's secrets, more than either of her sons suspected, and one of those secrets had a face, a child born of guilt and loyalty. If the auditors uncovered that birth certificate, the family tree would split open. She stared out at the garden where the roses had grown wild since the storm. Somewhere between guilt and duty, she made her decision. She would attend the hearing. But not to defend Miles, to control what truth would be allowed to surface. Back at the estate, Miles drafted a statement for the press, sterile, rehearsed, confident. The family welcomes the audit as a formality to ensure transparency and legal closure. It was the kind of lie his father had perfected, one that sounded noble enough to mask fear, but his actions betrayed him. He called contractors, accountants, and private investigators. He ordered every document in the vault to be digitized, scanned, and sealed under attorney privilege. Yet even as he worked, he couldn't shake the image of Evan walking into court with that draft page in his hand there, father's handwriting like a ghost testifying against him. 2 days before the hearing, a quiet visitor arrived at the gates, a woman in her mid-30s, carrying a single folder. Her name was Lila Raines. Her presence was not unexpected. It was inevitable. She was the daughter of the missing fisherman, the man tied to Harbor Point Estates. Miles met her in the foyer, his voice measured, his handshake firm. She did not stay long. When she left, the air felt heavier, the way it does after an earthquake that hasn't quite finished. That night, Miles poured another drink and stared at the storm's aftermath outside. The sea was calm again, deceptively calm. But he knew better. Every empire collapses quietly at first. In the city, Evan prepared for court. His expression was steady, but beneath it, something darker churned. This was not just about justice anymore, it was about rewriting the family's history. He had no illusions that exposure would cleanse anything. But he wanted truth to scar the name that had scarred him. The day before the hearing, an anonymous envelope arrived at his office. No sender. Inside, a photograph. Black and white, old, creased at the edges. It showed a man standing beside his father, shaking hands in front of the unfinished Harbor Point site. The man was not the fisherman. And behind them, half hidden by scaffolding, stood a young woman holding a child. On the back, a handwritten note. Every empire is built on someone's disappearance. Evan stared at it for a long time. The photo confirmed what he already suspected. Harbor Point wasn't just the foundation of their wealth, it was the foundation of their guilt. And if that photo was real, then the audit wouldn't just divide assets, it would resurrect the dead. As dawn rose over the coast, the Harrington mansion loomed like a monument to unfinished reckoning. The sea shimmered in deceptive peace, but the cliffs below were beginning to crumble, small fragments breaking off, falling into the water unnoticed. Inside, Carolyn sat by her mirror, wearing the same pearl necklace she'd worn the night her husband signed the first trust papers. In the reflection behind her, the house looked hollow, as if it were waiting to be vacated. She whispered a single sentence into the quiet morning, a sentence that belonged to no one but herself. Some inherit the land. Others inherit the lies. By the time the family gathered again, the Harrington Empire would no longer be measured in property, but in truth, and the cost of uncovering it. The courthouse stood like a relic from another century, marble columns streaked with rain, brass doors dulled by fingerprints of 1,000 forgotten disputes. But inside courtroom 3B, the air was unnaturally still, as though the building itself understood that the case unfolding within it was not merely legal. It was ancestral. The hearing of Harrington v. Harrington began under a thin veil of civility. Journalists crowded the back benches, their pens poised, their faces expressionless. To them, this was entertainment, another dynasty cracking under its own weight. But to those seated at the front, Carolyn, Miles, and Evan, it was the reckoning of decades. Miles arrived first, every movement calculated. His suit was immaculate, his cufflinks gold, his expression measured into neutrality. To the untrained eye, he was control personified. Yet beneath that calm exterior, a different rhythm beat, one of panic disguised as poise. Evan entered next, escorted by his attorney. He wore no armor but truth. His clothes were simple, his posture upright, his eyes fixed not on his brother, but on the judge's bench, a symbol of law stronger than any inheritance. Every step he took felt like walking into his father's shadow, only this time he wasn't afraid. And finally Carolyn, dressed in soft gray, pearls once again around her neck. Her presence silenced the room. Age had softened her form but sharpened her aura. She was not a bystander. She was the empire's last historian, the witness who remembered too much. The judge, an older man with weary eyes, began with the facts. The petition before the court seeks to unseal and audit the Harrington Trust under Clause 9b, equal distribution in absence of unified consent. The words echoed off marble, sterile, and final. For most families, a will was closure. For the Harringtons, it was a battlefield. The court clerk entered Exhibit 1, the sealed trust, its wax still intact after nearly 15 years. The seal bore the familiar insignia, interlocked H's beneath the curve of a wave, a symbol of pride turned emblem of war. As the clerk placed it before the judge, a shiver ran through Carolyn. She remembered that night, the sound of the seal being pressed into hot wax by her husband's trembling hand. He had insisted that the condition of unity remain. She had not questioned why. Only now, years later, did she understand the cruelty of it. He had designed his legacy to test them, not reward them. The judge's gavel struck once, the seal was broken. The room seemed to inhale, the clerk read the terms aloud. Paragraph by paragraph, line by line. The first pages were expected: allocations of properties, trust structures, dividend entitlements. But then came the clause. In absence of familial unity at the time of execution, all holdings shall revert to equal division among verified heirs. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The phrasing was irrefutable. Equal division, no exceptions. But what follows silenced even the whispers. Verification of heirs shall include all living descendants bearing the Harrington bloodline, regardless of recognition or circumstance of birth. Carolyn's hands trembled. Miles's jaw locked. Evan's eyes widened not in triumph, but disbelief. Their father had ensured that the truth he'd hidden in life would detonate after death. The court ordered an immediate audit of the estate. Every share, every property, every deed, all to be verified. Independent investigators would trace bloodlines, cross-reference records, and identify any unacknowledged heirs. The process would take weeks, but the implications were instant. Outside the courthouse, the story spread like wildfire. Harrington dynasty faces secret heir investigation. News anchors speculated. Investors panicked. Stock prices wavered. The family's empire, built on image as much as property, began to fracture publicly. In the days that followed, the auditors set up offices inside the Harrington estate. Boxes of documents were moved, scanned, catalogued. The sound of machines replaced the quiet grandeur of the halls. Servants were questioned. Old contracts were unearthed. And slowly patterns began to emerge. One file in particular drew attention. Harbor Point Estates, 2005. The land acquisition records contained inconsistencies, mismatched signatures, altered witness statements, a missing notary stamp. The auditors traced the original seller's name, Jacob Rains, marked as deceased, 2006, but no death certificate was ever filed. That name, Rains, echoed through the walls like a curse. Miles knew what it meant. So did Carolyn. And when Evan heard it, the photograph he'd received days earlier burned in his mind like prophecy. The auditors requested interviews. Carolyn declined at first, citing health. But one afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the estate windows, she summoned them to her sitting room. Her voice was soft, but every word she spoke rewrote the family's mythology. She told them of the early years, of a young developer named Jacob Rains, who owned a strip of land along the coast. Of how her husband had befriended him, promising partnership but delivering betrayal. Of how, when Jacob disappeared, she had begged her husband to come clean. And of how not long after, a child had been born, a child her husband had secretly supported through trusts and intermediaries. That child's name was Lila. The auditor's pens froze mid-note. Caroline's confession turned speculation into evidence. When the auditors returned to court with the findings, the report was clear. The Harrington Trust must be reopened to include Lila Rains as a potential heir. Miles's control over the narrative dissolved overnight. The empire he had ruled through intimidation was now subject to law. He tried to bury the evidence, to negotiate, to intimidate, but the documents were already public record. Evan had made sure of it. For Carolyn, the revelation brought no relief, only exhaustion. She spent her evenings in silence, watching the sea reclaim the cliffs below. Her husband had built their fortune by stealing land, and now, piece by piece, that same land was slipping away. Evan, though victorious, felt no peace. Justice, he realized, didn't heal. It only replaced silence with noise. But in the noise, he found clarity. His father had not merely created an empire. He had built a labyrinth, one where every exit led to someone else's ruin. The final hearing was scheduled for 1 week later. At stake was everything: the company, the estates, the name itself. The night before, Miles walked the estate grounds alone. The moonlight reflected on the sea like broken glass, For years, he had believed inheritance was a matter of possession. Now he understood it was a matter of exposure. In the distance, he saw a figure near the cliffs, slender, unmoving. Lila. She had come not to claim wealth, but to see where her father's land had ended and what it had cost. Miles approached, but she did not turn. The wind carried her words barely above the surf. "You built on stolen ground," she said, though no one heard it but the sea. By morning, the press had gathered at the gates again. The Empire's secrets were no longer whispers, they were headlines. And in a small office downtown, Evan received a call from an anonymous number. When he answered, a voice said only one thing: "You've opened the vault. But you haven't found what's buried beneath it." He froze. The line went dead. Outside his window, the city shimmered like glass, flawless from afar, fractured up close. The real storm hadn't even begun. The week between hearings was a storm without rain. The Harrington estate, once a symbol of wealth and permanence, had turned into a fortress of anxiety. Investigators moved through its halls like archaeologists, unearthing a civilization built on denial. Every box they opened released a ghost. Every document carried a stain. The estate staff had learned to walk quietly. Even the clocks seemed to tick softer, as if unwilling to mark the passage of these particular days. In the study, where the portraits of past Harringtons loomed like silent judges, Miles spent each hour barricaded behind paperwork, phone calls, and futile attempts at damage control. But there are certain forces that no empire, no matter how fortified, can contain. Truth was one of them. The preliminary audit report arrived on a Thursday morning. A thin folder, yet heavy enough to tilt the axis of everything that followed. It contained the findings of the Harbor Point investigation. The missing fisherman, Jacob Rains, had never been declared dead. He had disappeared without record. His property was sold using a falsified signature. His bank accounts were drained 2 days later by a shell company, one registered under an alias linked to Harrington Holdings Limited. It was a ghost company. A financial shadow created to absorb blame and dissolve paper trails. But even shadows leave shapes. One of the auditors, a quiet man with ink-stained fingers, followed the trail further. He uncovered a second set of documents, buried in an offshore archive in Nassau. Those papers bore 3 names: Miles Harrington, Thomas Weller, and D. Rains. The last name struck like thunder. Because D. Rains wasn't Jacob, it was Daniel, his son. The implication was immediate and monstrous. The missing man hadn't vanished alone. He had been silenced, and his son, still a child, had been taken into custody under a falsified guardianship program funded by Harrington Holdings. The boy had disappeared into the system. No death certificate, no adoption record, only silence. By the time the auditors presented this to the court, the Harrington legacy had crossed the line from scandal to crime. Evan read the report in disbelief. The photograph he had received earlier now took on new meaning. The child in the image wasn't a stranger, it was Daniel. His father's other heir. The one who was never meant to return. Lila's existence had rewritten inheritance. But Daniel's disappearance rewrote morality. Caroline sat in her private lounge when the report reached her. The morning sun streamed through lace curtains, lighting the dust in the air like suspended time. Her hands shook as she read, though she had known fragments of this long ago. Her husband had confessed parts of it to her during his final illness, half-muttered words in the dark about the boy, about mistakes that had to vanish. She had prayed those words were delirium. They weren't. Her tears fell silently, tracing the lines of age down her face. Wealth had protected them for decades, but now it only magnified their shame. Miles reacted differently. He tore through the documents with disbelief, denial, and then fury. His father's empire, the one he had spent his life maintaining, had been poisoned from the start. He wasn't defending legacy anymore. He was defending rot. That night, when the staff had gone and the estate was finally silent, he descended into the cellar archives. The air was damp and heavy with salt from the sea below. He opened metal filing cabinets older than him, contracts, tax returns, shipping logs. And there, behind a panel of false drawers, he found it. An unmarked box. Inside were photographs. Black and white. Time-stained. They showed the early construction of harbor, point. Laborers standing beside bulldozers, engineers surveying land, and most damning his father standing with a man who was clearly not Jacob Rains but bore his surname. Beside them was another figure, a woman holding a young boy. Daniel. On the back of one photograph, his father's handwriting read, "All debts settled." No loose ends. But there was one loose end, and his name was Evan. At that same hour, Evan was in the city, preparing for the next hearing. His attorney was reviewing filings, cross-referencing bank records. The evidence was overwhelming. Yet Evan felt no triumph. Instead, he felt the quiet ache of realization that exposing truth was not the same as reclaiming peace. For years, he had blamed his brother for everything. The arrogance, the exclusion, the control. But now, reading the auditor's notes, he understood that Miles had inherited more than property. He had inherited complicity. Their father had built him in his own image, molded him through discipline and loyalty until ethics blurred with obedience. Evan stood by the window of his apartment, watching the city flicker in patterns of power and illusion. He wondered if he was any different. He was dismantling an empire, yes, but to what end? Justice? Revenge? Or the same hunger for control that ran in their blood? On the coast, the sea roared louder that night. The waves carved deeper into the cliff, the sound like tearing fabric. The Harrington estate stood illuminated against the dark horizon, each window a fragment of history refusing to dim. And in one of those windows, Caroline watched the storm gather again. She saw the sea not as nature, but as judgment. For years, she had believed the past could be buried in concrete, that luxury could seal away guilt. But concrete cracks, water finds every fault line. And truth, like the tide, always returns. The following morning, a new envelope arrived at the estate, hand-delivered unmarked. Inside, a single sheet of paper with a typed message. Daniel Rains is alive. He remembers. Miles read it once, twice, then again, as though repetition could change meaning. The words pulsed with dread. Alive, remembers. He poured himself a drink and sat in silence. The empire had been built on someone's disappearance, and now that someone was coming back. Across the city, Evan received an identical envelope. No signature, same words. He read them slowly and for the first time felt fear. For years, they had both fought over inheritance, money, power, property. But this wasn't about inheritance anymore. It was about accountability. And accountability was a currency neither of them had ever learned to pay. That night, thunder rolled again over the coast. The sea battered the rocks until white spray rose like ghosts reaching for the land that had stolen their peace. Inside the house, Caroline stood in the hallway, listening to the echoes of storms past. She thought of her husband's empire, of her sons at war, of the lives destroyed for the illusion of permanence. And as lightning split the sky, she whispered to no one. The land always remembers. The next morning, the newspapers carried a new headline. Missing heir found. Daniel Rains to testify in Harrington case. The empire trembled. The news broke before dawn. Across the city, television screens glowed with the same headline. Daniel Rains found alive, missing heir to testify in Harrington case. For years, Daniel had been a ghost in financial archives, a whisper in court documents, a name only spoken behind closed doors. But now he had a face, and that face was everywhere. Grainy photos from a rural rehabilitation center outside Charleston showed a man in his 30s, his expression distant, his body thin but unbroken. He was alive, and his memory had returned. The story spread like wildfire. Talk shows speculated. Legal analysts dissected. The Harrington name, once synonymous with power, was now paired with corruption and cover-up. Investors began to withdraw. The stock value of Harrington Holdings fell 12% in a single morning. Inside the estate, the phones never stopped ringing. Miles ignored them all. He sat in a study, surrounded by silence so thick it seemed to hum. He read the article again, his reflection faint in the glass of the framed newspaper clippings from better years. Harrington Tower opens downtown. Brothers expand oceanfront portfolio. Legacy continues. Now, that legacy was collapsing beneath headlines of fraud and disappearance. He poured a drink but didn't touch it. The amber liquid trembled with the shaking of his hand. He knew what came next. Subpoenas. Depositions. The court would reopen the trust not as a civil matter, but as a criminal investigation. Harbor Point was no longer just a disputed property. It was a crime scene long buried beneath real estate and greed. Evan arrived unannounced. He didn't knock. The doors of the estate had ceased to mean privacy. When he stepped into the study, the air between them was heavy with something deeper than anger. It was the weight of recognition, of finally understanding the other. They didn't speak. Words would have been dishonest. Instead, Evan placed a file on the desk, the preliminary statement from Daniel's legal representative. Miles's eyes followed the page, scanning names, dates, claims. And there, at the bottom, a line written in cold clarity. The witness asserts that the disappearance of Jacob and Daniel Rains was orchestrated under direct instruction of Richard Harrington, with knowledge and logistical support from Miles Harrington. Miles froze. His breath caught somewhere between disbelief and horror. His father's sins had been expected. His own inclusion unthinkable. Yet, as he read further, the memories began to surface, fragments of conversations, brief directives from his father during his early 20s. Handle the paperwork. Keep the contractors quiet. Make sure the land is cleared. He had never asked questions. He had only followed orders. And now, those orders had become his confession. Outside, the sea roared against the cliffs. The tide was high again, as though echoing the rise of long-suppressed truths. The storm clouds gathered over the horizon, slow and deliberate. Caroline heard the news from her caretaker. She sat by her window in stunned silence, the world beyond the glass blurred by rain and guilt. Daniel's return meant the end of her illusions. For years she had told herself she was protecting her family from pain. But in truth, she had protected their wealth from consequence. Now, both were gone. That evening, the press surrounded the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed, voices shouted, questions filled the air like hailstones. And through that chaos came a single figure, escorted by 2 officers, Daniel Rains. He moved slowly, deliberately. His eyes were calm, but his presence radiated the kind of power that can't be inherited, only earned through survival. The journalist called his name, begged for comment, but he said nothing. He simply looked up toward the courthouse doors as though facing a monument built from his father's bones. Inside the courtroom, silence reigned. Miles sat at the defendant's table, his lawyer whispering strategies he barely heard. Evan sat a few seats away, his own legal team prepared for testimony. Between them, space, vast, cold, and irreversible. When Daniel entered, the entire room shifted. He didn't look at them right away. His eyes wandered across the benches, the marble columns, the seal of justice above the judge's chair. Then, slowly, he turned toward the brothers who had inherited the empire built on his ruin. He was not angry. He was something else, something beyond revenge. He was the living proof that truth survives even when men try to bury it under concrete. The judge began. Formalities, introductions, oaths. The sound of shuffling papers filled the silence. When Daniel finally took the stand, the courtroom held its breath. He spoke softly. Each sentence deliberate, like a stone placed carefully upon a grave. He told of his father, Jacob Rains, a man of principle, proud but desperate. Of the deal with Richard Harrington, who promised partnership but delivered betrayal. Of the day men came to their home, claiming new ownership of the land. Of the confusion, the threats, the night when his father vanished, and he was taken away under the guise of protection. He described being moved between institutions, foster homes, and facilities until memory itself began to erode. But fragments remained: the shape of the coastline, the sound of waves, the word harbor written on blueprints his father had once drawn. And then the one name he never forgot, Harrington. Every word echoed like thunder across the marble walls. Caroline wept silently in the gallery. Miles sat motionless, pale, as though hearing his own eulogy. Evan closed his eyes. The empire that had defined them all was dissolving into confession. When Daniel finished, the judge called for recess. The press erupted outside. Reporters sprinted to telephones. Inside, silence fell again, heavy and endless. That night, the estate was dark. No lights in the windows. No movement in the halls. The family that once measured success in acres and titles now measured it in survival. Miles wandered the empty rooms, listening to the echoes of his own footsteps. Every sound was memory. The laughter of childhood. The lectures of his father. The distant piano his mother once played. He stopped before the portrait of Richard Harrington, staring at the eyes that had once commanded him to obey. "You built this house on theft," he thought, "and I spent my life keeping it standing." Outside, the waves pounded the cliffs harder than ever, tearing new shapes into the stone. Nature was reclaiming what greed had stolen. The land finally was fighting back. In the distance, Evan watched from his car parked along the coastal road. He saw the estate illuminated briefly by lightning, then fade into darkness again. He realized then that inheritance was never about ownership, it was about consequence. And for the Harringtons, consequence had finally arrived. By morning, the newspapers bore a new headline: "Court rules in favor of Raines family, Harrington Holdings under federal investigation." The empire was dead. But the reckoning had just begun. The morning after the verdict, the sea was unnaturally calm, a silence so vast it felt staged, as if the world itself were holding its breath before another collapse. The Harrington estate stood against the horizon, its windows shuttered, its gardens waterlogged and wine-burned from weeks of storms. It looked less like a home now and more like a mausoleum, a monument to everything power had devoured. News vans lined the road beyond the gates. Reporters spoke in hushed voices to their cameras, reciting the end of an empire. The headlines were merciless: "Harrington Holdings under criminal inquiry. Hidden heirs testimony shatters dynasty. The family that owned the coast now faces the tide." Inside, the silence was broken only by the ticking of a clock somewhere deep in the hall. Miles sat alone in his father's old chair, surrounded by boxes of evidence. The empire had shrunk to paperwork. Ledgers, deeds, court transcripts, a graveyard of signatures and lies. He hadn't slept since the verdict. The Scotch glass on the desk was untouched, condensation pooling beneath it like a slow leak of time. He stared at a photograph, the same one Daniel had presented in court. His father, Jacob Raines, and the boy standing beside the half-built Harbor Point pier. The boy's face was half in shadow. Miles had tried to forget that image, but now it followed him everywhere. His father's hand resting on his shoulder, that unspoken command: never question, only continue. For the first time in his life, Miles felt the full gravity of what that obedience had cost. Not just money, not just reputation. It had cost people. Outside the study, investigators moved through the halls with the quiet precision of surgeons. Federal agents cataloged artifacts for evidence: financial ledgers, notarized contracts, correspondence logs. The house that once symbolized control was now a crime scene dressed in heritage. Caroline watched them from the staircase. Her pearls were gone, her hair unpinned. The grandeur that once wrapped her like armor had fallen away, leaving only a fragile woman trapped between guilt and resignation. She thought of Daniel, not as an accuser, but as a child who should have played in this very house, chasing sunlight through the corridors like her own sons once did. In another life perhaps he would have. The federal inquiry expanded fast. What began as a case of inheritance fraud evolved into a full-scale investigation into illegal land acquisitions, offshore laundering, and political bribery spanning 3 decades. Harrington Holdings had been the empire everyone wanted to believe in. Clean money, solid assets, legacy in its purest form. But now it was revealed for what it truly was, an empire of stolen foundations. Evan became a reluctant witness in the investigation. The prosecutors wanted his testimony, his insight, his documents. He gave them what he could, but every statement felt like another wound. He had come seeking justice, but in the light of exposure, justice and destruction had become the same thing. He visited Daniel once, not in court but privately, at the small government safe house where Daniel was being kept for protection. The meeting lasted only minutes. No words were exchanged. Daniel had simply looked at him, eyes steady, expression unreadable. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't blame. It was recognition, the acknowledgement that both had lived different sides of the same lie. When Evan left, he realized something terrifying. Truth didn't free anyone. It only changed the shape of their prison. Back at the estate, Miles's control eroded with each passing day. The company's board had voted to remove him as acting chairman. The shareholders were fleeing. The properties, once worth billions, were now frozen assets pending seizure. His emails went unanswered. His lawyers avoided his calls. The Harrington name, the one he had dedicated his life to defending, had become a liability. On the 3rd night after the verdict, Miles walked the coastal path that wound down from the cliffs to the old boathouse. The path had been closed for years, erosion having eaten parts of it away. The sea below crashed in constant fury, its spray rising like breath from an unseen beast. Each step echoed with memories, his father's voice, his brother's defiance, his mother's tears. The boathouse was half collapsed, its roof caved in, its windows salt-stained and broken. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and rust. But beneath the decay lay the remnants of plans, blueprints rolled in tubes, maps pinned to walls, charts of land surveys from a forgotten time. This was where the empire had begun. And this was where he realized it had always been doomed. He found his father's old compass lying on a workbench, the brass green with age. He held it in his palm. The needle spun wildly, unable to find north. It was fitting. Upstairs in the house, Caroline waited for him. She had written a letter, not to apologize, but to explain. In delicate handwriting, she recounted everything she had learned about the Harbor Point deal, her husband's manipulation, the guilt that had grown like ivy around her heart. She ended it simply. We were custodians, not creators. The land was never ours to own. She left it on the dining table, beside a photograph of her 2 sons as children. Then she extinguished the lights and sat by the window, watching the ocean's endless breathing. When Miles returned, he found the house empty of sound. He read the letter twice. The words blurred, the ink smudged by his trembling fingers. Something inside him cracked, not in rage this time, but in release. He walked into the study, opened the safe behind the portrait, and withdrew one final envelope, his father's sealed confession. The document had been hidden for years, known only to him. Inside were pages detailing the Harbor Point acquisition, the payoffs, the names of accomplices, even the falsified death record of Jacob Rains. His father had written it before his death, perhaps intending to destroy it, perhaps intending to be found. Miles sat back in the leather chair and stared at the pages. For the first time in his life, he made a decision not to protect, but to surrender. For Daniel Rains, for the land we took, for what can never be rebuilt. The investigators moved swiftly. Within hours, the estate was sealed under federal order. Caroline was escorted to her sister's home in the city. Evan was contacted by the prosecution as a cooperating witness. Miles was taken quietly, no resistance, no spectacle, only silence. The empire was gone. The land reclaimed its memory. Weeks later, the sea began to reclaim the cliffs beneath the estate. One stormy night, the outer garden walls collapsed into the surf. By dawn, the once perfect terraces had vanished beneath gray foam. Nature had no interest in preserving history. It only knew how to erase it. Daniel stood on the shore one morning, far below what remained of the estate. The wind whipped through his coat, carrying salt and ghosts. He looked at the ruins above, at the land his father had once owned, and whispered something no one heard but the waves. It wasn't victory, it was closure. Not forgiveness, but finality. And above him, the last standing window of the Harrington house reflected the light one final time, before shattering in the wind and falling into the sea. Months passed before the storm inside the courtroom finally matched the calm outside it. The sea, once furious, now moved with a rhythm of tired forgiveness, a steady breathing of tide against stone, as though it had grown weary of punishing the land. But the damage remained, visible and invisible. The Harrington estate had been stripped of its grandeur. Federal markers sealed the gates. Yellow tape fluttered like torn ribbons across the drive. The gardens, once sculpted to perfection, were wild now, grass uncut, hedges sprawling over marble paths, the fountain dry and cracked. Birds had returned to the terraces, nesting in places once polished to gleam. Nature was repossessing its property. The world had moved on to newer scandals, but in the silence left behind, the ruins told their own story. Every stone, every beam carried memory. And memory was heavier than any verdict. In the city, the trial's conclusion filled the newspapers for the last time. The court had accepted Miles Harrington's written confession as formal evidence, closing the criminal investigation with a plea agreement. He had cooperated fully, detailing the network of fraud that had operated under his father's shadow. In exchange for testimony, he avoided prison but lost everything else: his wealth, his company, his name. He was last seen leaving the courthouse through a side door, wearing the same gray suit he had worn during his father's funeral years earlier. Cameras caught him walking away from the steps, alone, without driver or escort. He was not chased. There was nothing left to chase. He disappeared into anonymity, a man unburdened by wealth, but bound to memory. Evan, now living in a small apartment overlooking the harbor, had become a reluctant public figure. Reporters wanted his opinion, his forgiveness, his narrative of redemption. But he refused every interview. He spent his days writing instead, not memoirs, not confessions, but something quieter. Notes, fragments, recollections. Perhaps he was trying to document what empire does to the soul before time erases it. Each morning, he walked to the shoreline and watched the cranes dismantle the old Harbor Point structures, the steel frames that had once been his father's triumphs, now reduced to recyclable scrap. Each fall of metal echoed through the harbor like the slow undoing of history. He thought often of Daniel, the man who had returned from absence, not to destroy, but to exist. In that, there was a strange kind of mercy. Daniel Raines had declined all financial settlements. The court had awarded him partial ownership of reclaimed Harbor Point lands, but he transferred it to a local conservation trust. The land would remain undeveloped, a protected coastline, untouched, preserved, unprofitable. When asked why, he'd given no statement. Only a brief message through his attorney. Some ground should never be built on again. Caroline lived quietly in the city, away from reporters and curious neighbors. The years had dimmed her presence, yet she carried herself with the same quiet dignity, though her eyes now reflected a constant grief. She spoke rarely, mostly to her sister or to the caretaker who brought her tea each morning. The world called her complicit, but in her silence there was punishment enough. Every week, she wrote letters to both her sons, not of regret, but of remembrance. "We were part of a story larger than us," she wrote once. And stories built on silence always end the same way, with echoes. No one replied, but the act of writing became her only form of prayer. By autumn, the estate was auctioned. Developers came and went, eyeing the land for hotels or private residences, but the soil refused to cooperate. The cliffs continued to crumble. Engineers deemed it unstable. No foundation would hold. The land had memory, and memory rejected reconstruction. In time, the government designated the property as a historical caution site, an example of environmental and ethical negligence in urban expansion. A plaque was erected near the entrance. The Harrington estate, built on false foundations. Tourists came for photographs. Locals avoided it. Evan visited once, on a gray November afternoon. The house was gone by then, reduced to skeletal walls and ivy. The air smelled of salt and dust. He walked the perimeter, boots sinking into soft soil, and stopped at the edge of the cliff. The wind tugged at his coat. Below, the ocean breathed, endless and unchanging. He thought of the dinner where it had all begun. The heavy silver, the tense silence, the careless remark that had ignited the feud. "Just tell me when the reunion is." It felt like a lifetime ago, spoken by a different man in a different world. The reunion had come, just not the way anyone had imagined. Not in laughter, not in reconciliation, but in reckoning. He closed his eyes and imagined what forgiveness might sound like if it had a voice. Not words, not excuses. Only the wind through broken windows and the sound of waves against the cliff. That night, rain swept across the coast again. The remnants of the estate shuddered under its weight, the final traces of architecture dissolving into memory. Far inland, Caroline passed quietly in her sleep, her final letter left unopened on her bedside table. In it, she had written to both sons, "The sea does not hate the shore for what it takes. It only reminds it what it cannot keep." Evan received the news the next morning. He read her letter beneath the same dawn light that once reflected off his father's empire. The words didn't break him. They settled into him, like sediment finding its rightful layer in the earth. And when he walked again by the sea, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. Small green shoots pushing through the cracks where the estate walls had once stood. Life, stubborn and silent, reclaiming what men had ruined. The story of the Harringtons was over, but the land remained, untamed, unforgiving, alive. 10 years passed. The sea, tireless as ever, had reshaped the coast. Where once the Harrington estate had stood, proud and impossible, there was now only open ground and the whisper of waves against eroded cliffs. The plaque remained, weathered but legible, "The Harrington estate, built on false foundations." It was not a ruin anymore. It was memory, fossilized in salt and silence. The land had changed hands many times in those 10 years, yet no one lived upon it. Attempts at construction failed, each project defeated by nature. Landslides, sinkholes, salt corrosion. The engineers called it instability. The locals called it justice. The ocean had claimed what was once stolen, and it would not release it again. But not everything was washed away. Across the bay, on the opposite ridge, a new structure stood, not of marble or wealth, but of purpose. A modest research center, built by the Rains Foundation for Environmental Ethics. Funded quietly by Daniel and sustained by grants, it studied erosion patterns, coastal preservation, and the moral history of land use. Students visited, journalists wrote about it, and in time the name Rains became synonymous with restoration. The name Harrington, however, belonged to the past. Evan lived quietly nearby, in a small cottage overlooking the sea. His hair had thinned and silvered. The years had not softened him, but they had steadied him. He spent most of his time writing, still, though not about empire or law but about cycles. How everything built on wrong eventually finds its collapse, and how even collapse can be a kind of mercy. He had chosen solitude not as escape, but as penance. Each morning, he walked the same narrow path down to the shore. The ground there was uneven, the remnants of the old driveway still faintly visible beneath moss and grass. Some days, he stopped before the plaque, brushing away salt residue with his sleeve. He would read the inscription, not as condemnation, but as reminder. The land remembers. Always. One afternoon, a letter arrived, sealed with the insignia of the Rains Foundation. Inside, a short note in Daniel's handwriting. "We're holding a small gathering to mark the 10th year since the verdict. I'd like you to come. There's something I think you should see. Evan stared at the signature for a long time. Daniel Rains, the man whose childhood had been taken by his family's ambition, the man whose truth had dismantled their empire. He had not seen Daniel since the trial. They had lived parallel lives, each carrying half the burden of the same history. That evening, Evan walked down to the cliffs, watching the sunset stain the horizon gold. The decision wasn't easy. But some silences, he realized, must eventually end, not with answers, but with acknowledgement. A week later, he went. The drive to the research center was short, but surreal. The road wound past new growth, saplings and wild grass reclaiming the coast. Where machines had once roared, the sound of wind now reigned. The air smelled cleaner, the world quieter. When he arrived, the building stood against the light like something humble yet eternal. Its walls were simple, wood and stone, designed to weather, not dominate. A handful of people were gathered outside, researchers, local officials, students. Among them Daniel. He had aged too, but there was something unbroken in him. His posture, his calm, the strength of a man who had rebuilt himself from the ground that once buried him. The two men met without ceremony. No cameras, no witnesses, just wind and distance. Evan offered a nod. Daniel returned it. Words would have been too small for what stood between them. Daniel gestured toward a small path that led to the edge of the cliff, where the view opened to the entire bay. They walked in silence until they reached a newly placed stone marker, a polished slate embedded in the earth. On it, an inscription carved in clean, simple lines, for those lost to greed. For those who rose from it. Below, two names were etched. Jacob Rains, 1957 to 2006. Richard Harrington, 1949 to 2009. For a long moment, Evan could not speak. The sight of the two names together, predator and victim, entwined by history, was almost unbearable. But the way they rested side by side, equal now in memory, carried a strange peace. It was as if the earth itself had insisted on balance at last. Daniel turned to him, his voice quiet, almost indistinguishable from the wind. It's not forgiveness, he said. Just truth, finally settled. Evan nodded. He understood. They stood there until the sun dipped low, the tide pulling light away from the cliffs. The sound of the waves below was steady, patient, the rhythm of endings and beginnings repeating as they always had. Before leaving, Daniel handed Evan a small envelope. Inside was a deed, a symbolic transfer of a small parcel of the coastline, designated as Harrington Cove. It was to be protected land, co-managed by both the Rains Foundation and the local community. Land should be remembered, Daniel said simply. Not owned. Evan held the paper like it was a living thing. The words blurred as his eyes filled with quiet understanding. The empire had once been measured in acres. Now it was measured in humility. That night, as he walked back along the empty road, the stars broke open above the sea. He thought of his parents, his brother, of the years lost to ambition. He thought of Daniel's eyes, not hard, not kind, but real. And for the first time, he realized that the Harrington name had not ended in disgrace. It had ended in consequence. And consequence was honest. At dawn, he stood again by the shore. The tide was low, revealing black stones and the faint outlines of what had once been the estate's foundations. Waves lapped gently over them, soft and deliberate, smoothing the edges. He watched until the sea covered them completely, until the surface was pure again, unbroken, infinite. In that moment, Evan understood what his mother had meant in her final letter. The sea does not hate the shore for what it takes. It only reminds it what it cannot keep. And with that, he turned away from the water and began walking inland, toward whatever small life remained, cleansed of ownership, heavy with truth, and light with understanding. Years passed again. The world had changed, as it always does, but the coast remained faithful, tireless, ancient. The waves continued their patient work, erasing history grain by grain, smoothing sharp edges into silence. Where men had once built empires, now only gulls drifted in salt air. The land that had once been the Harrington estate was now a sanctuary, a coastal preserve spanning miles of protected terrain. It was called the Rains Harrington Restoration Site, a name chosen not for ownership, but acknowledgement. The government had declared it a living monument to accountability and renewal. School children came on field trips to walk its trails and listen to the sea. Scientists came to study how nature heals what greed destroys. And some came simply to stand in silence, to remember the price of inheritance. The foundation that Daniel Rains had built thrived. It was no longer about revenge or restitution. It was about understanding. Every project, every lecture, every study it funded carried the same belief, that the ground beneath us remembers everything, and it demands truth in its own time. Daniel himself had aged quietly. His face carried lines of both suffering and survival. He rarely spoke about the past, and when he did, it was only to remind others that the past, if left unacknowledged, becomes architecture, permanent and poisonous. He still walked the cliffs some evenings, stopping by the slate marker where two names shared a single monument, Jacob Rains and Richard Harrington. He would lay a hand on the cold stone and whisper to no one, "This is where we meet." Equal, finally. Across the bay, in a small cottage now weathered by decades of sea air, Evan Harrington lived out his later years in simplicity. His books filled the shelves, volumes of philosophy, history, ethics, interspersed with his own unpublished manuscripts. He never wrote about the trial. He never used his family's name in public again. But in his notebooks, he chronicled the way empires decay, not from attack, but from the weight of their own lies. Each morning, he watched the sun rise over the restored coastline. It was still strange to him, the absence of grandeur, the quiet where ambition once thundered. Yet he had come to love that quiet. It was the sound of truth settling like dust after a storm. The villagers who lived nearby knew him only as the old rider by the cliffs. Some said he was once rich, others said he had lost everything. Few knew which version was true, and he never corrected them. The truth, he understood now, was not a headline, it was a weight one carried privately. One spring morning, Daniel visited him. No announcement, no ceremony, just the quiet arrival of an old car on a gravel road. Evan opened the door before Daniel could knock. They hadn't seen each other in years, but time had softened the distance between them. They sat on the porch overlooking the sea, drinking tea in silence. Words were unnecessary. The air between them carried more meaning than any conversation could. The same tide that had once swallowed their father's sins now reflected sunlight in shimmering gold. The land looked healed. After a long pause, Daniel said, "They asked me to give a speech next month. 10 years since the restoration began." Evan smiled faintly. "And what will you say?" Daniel looked toward the horizon. "That nothing is ever truly owned. Not land, not legacy, not even forgiveness." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was peace, the kind that only comes when every truth has been faced and accepted. That evening, as Daniel drove away, Evan remained on the porch until the light faded. The wind rose softly, carrying the distant murmur of waves against the cliffs. He closed his eyes and thought of the dinner table all those years ago, the candles, the silver, the tension thick enough to breathe. He could still hear his younger self saying, "Just tell me when the reunion is." He smiled to himself. The reunion had come not as a gathering of family, but as a return of truth. The kind of reunion no one wants, but everyone needs. Later that year, Evan passed quietly in his sleep. When the news reached Daniel, he returned to the cottage by the cliffs and found, on the desk, a stack of papers bound with string. On the cover page, written in Evan's careful handwriting, were 4 words, "The land remembers everything." Daniel read every page. They were reflections, part memoir, part confession, about legacy, guilt, and the fragile morality of men who believe the earth belongs to them. At the end, Evan had written, "We measure wealth in acres, but the soil measures us in truth. The sea takes only what we build in arrogance. The rest, it forgives. Daniel stood for a long time by the window, holding the manuscript against the light. Outside, the sea shimmered, endless and alive. He placed the pages beside a photograph of the old estate, then stepped outside to the edge of the cliffs. The air was cool, the horizon gold with dusk. He whispered, "You were right. The land remembers." Then he turned toward the trail leading back to the research center. The wind at his back, the ocean's roar fading behind him. The coastline stretched before him, raw, reclaimed, eternal. And far below, where the estate's foundations once lay buried beneath the sand, the tide receded just enough to reveal something extraordinary. Small stones glistening in the sun, forming a natural pattern in the sand, a perfect circle. It wasn't built by human hands. It was nature's quiet punctuation, the final full stop to a story of inheritance, deception, and redemption. A reminder that every empire ends, but the land remains.